On to the field of battle. A treatise concerning the nature of the human mind. By Felipe Bautista. Introduction. The phantasms of the mind are many. Dreams, hallucinations, mirages. When I ingest certain psychoactive compounds, example, lysergic acid diethylamide, or some variant of psilocybe cubensis, for instance, I find, after a certain while, that certain forms, hitherto unaccounted for by my ordinary faculty of perception, do, with an unrelentingly vivacious vigor, I dare say, impart themselves overpoweringly to my own mind. Until, at last, I find that, where once I believed there to be only a tree, when not under the spell of any psychoactives that is, now I perceive some unspeakable variety of extravaganza. And, where the tree appeared to me to be stationary before, now it engages in a form of mystical ballet. Such that, words, not even those of the most cultivated of poets, satisfactorily may convey the precise nature of. For, as the master Hume remarkably expressed it, all the colors of poetry, however splendid, can never paint natural objects in such a manner as to make the description be taken for a real landscape. Aggregating that, the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. The present text will be concerning the nature of the human mind. Yet, more precisely, concerning two varieties of theory concerning the mind and its operations. The first, the reproductional, the second, the original. In order to make more clear in what lies the distinction between these two varieties of theory concerning the nature of the mind of man, let us return to our preceding example of the young man on LSD perceiving a tree. Under ordinary circumstances, that is, having not ingested either LSD nor any other narcotical substance of psychoactive efficacy, our young man will go to no great lengths to dispute that, when he perceives a tree, he perceives only a tree. However, administer to this same young man a substantial dose of lysergic acid diethylamide, and we shall encounter that, where he once pronounced a tree to be merely a tree, now he outright remarks, no, it is more than merely a tree, it is an intricate array of moving vibrational and geometrical dancing forms, waving as if in the waters of a sea, though, in this case, in the waters of the mind. The scientific researcher who has administered, to our young protagonist, his hefty LSD dose, forthwith makes an appearance, and begins to ask certain questions of the young man, asking him concerning his sentiments, his thoughts, and his perceptions. And, finally, after a period of 12 or so hours, the researcher, again, returns, and, again, asks our protagonist concerning the qualities already mentioned, noting that no longer does our protagonist declare to be under the spell of the psychoactive, the tree having returned to its normal, ordinary, state, he declares, and the same of all his other perceptions. That is, after 12 or so hours, the protagonist discovers that the alterations to perception rendered in the episode attended his ingestion of the compound, LSD, were, in fact, transitory. That is, eventually, they wore off. I have already used the word phantasms in the present text. And I should like to suggest that, if we are better to comprehend intellectually what we shall aim to imply when we pronounce concerning what we've hitherto denominated theories concerning the nature of the mind of man, it will be of the most use and of the most benefit to our knowledge and to our comprehension to discuss concerning what we mean when we employ our terminology, phantasms. Let us, first of all, en passant, approach our understanding of our terminology strictly etymologically, and language certainly will play a very central role in all to follow. Indeed, language seems to be principally inherent, whatever that may mean. Now returning to our text. The term phantasm comes from the Greek, phano, literally, to bring to light, which, in turn, derives from the Greek, phos, literally meaning light. Light seems to play a central part in all of this. For, when I perceive the moon, I say that the moon is in the light of my perception. However, when I return to my chamber and forthwith close my eyes, to enter into profound slumber, following a day's heavy expenditures and the carrying out of various obligations and labors, as a man must carry out, for the proper and venerable living of his given life, I say, the moon no longer is apparent in the light of my perception, though I may suppose it still exists. That is, I may suppose the moon depends not upon its being lit up in my perception for its own capacity to independently subsist. Certain philosophers of recent years have postulated that the apple that I perceive resting on my escritoire may not possibly exist independently of that situation. Namely, independently of the situation of its being perceived to be. And certain eminent philosophers have even gone to extreme lengths to propose that esse est percipi. The categorization of philosophies of mind may be an arduous task, yet made more incomprehensibly facile and indisputably less arduous when we employ our imagination. Now, much will be said concerning the imagination in this text, principally because, naturally, it plays such a central role in any treatise aiming fully to account for what men have called the mind. But why the mind? Of all the topics and the themes a man may have chosen to sit down and write a discourse on, of all possible topics to select from, ranging from the Romans' occupation of the northern part of Africa during the period of the reign of Cleopatra in Egypt, to the subtle implications inherent in a profound reading of the works of Homer, and even to the nature of the vile atrocities enacted in that period, men have denominated World War II, and any of many more possible uncountable topics and innumerable themes of which your mind may fancy upon. Why the mind? Why write a treatise on the mind? For my part, I shall say that I find indisputably and unrelentingly remarkable the operations of the mind. Yes, one cannot dispute that there lie uncountably and innumerably many fascinating and worthy of our undivided attention features and qualities in the Roman relationship to the Cleopatrian Ptolemaic Egyptians, in the intricacies of the works of Homer, even in the economic and the cultural devastations that accompanied the conflict called the Second World War. Certainly, all of these topics are very worthy of our attention and of our dedication to their proper understanding and comprehension. I shall not dispute this on any account, no. Nevertheless, upon listening to the intricate arrangement and the spellbindingly splendid beauty of Rachmaninoff's extraordinary and sublime piano concertos, I cannot help but be brought to tears. For, as a result of some force which I cannot describe, the notes of these great masterpieces stir my heart against my will. And I note that all of this is an event occurring in the mind. And, for that reason, and for many more which I can list, in a list truly ad infinitum, as it were, I find that, though other topics, sure, are fascinating, nevertheless, the mind is a worthy topic of discussion. For, I cannot imagine that the great Rachmaninoff himself would have been able to produce his legendary masterpieces absent the operations of the mind. Let us suppose that there never was any mind. From this, it follows that there never was my mind, yours, nor, I almost dare not even say it, the mind of the legendary maestro, Rachmaninoff, himself. I have to believe that, because I have access to the legendary compositions of the great maestro, that the great maestro, himself, was endowed with mind. Indeed, I have to suppose that the extraordinary masterworks of the illustrious maestro had their origins in a mind, more precisely, in the mind of Rachmaninoff. That is one reason, alone, that I consider the mind a fascinating topic, and very worthy of our attention. Why? Because it may produce such wonders as the masterpieces of Rachmaninoff. Yet it may produce such incontestably beautiful sonatas as those of Beethoven, of Chopin, and of Schumann. It may even produce the devastatingly beautiful use of words and prose encountered in the Metamorphoses of Ovid and in the works of Keats. Certain men of the present era have suggested that the mind is activated in its operations by the chemistry of neurons, positing that, when I think, in fact, what's happening is, certain very tiny microcorpuscles are interacting in the brain. Certain microcorpuscles denominated neurons in the scientific talks of men, electrochemically discharging, creating the subjective hallucination that I exist inside a world. Now, their arguments may seem convincing to the philosophically untrained mind. However, there have been those other men who have outright rejected these sentiments, suggesting, in wide opposition to the notion that the neuron produces the mind and all of its concomitant hallucinations, instead, that the neurons produce not the hallucinations, Rather, the hallucinations force the mind to invent the concept of microcorpuscles to account for the unusual predicament of its finding itself in a world active in one also. At least, apparently, at least, sensorily. The Master Hume certainly may be considered as pertaining to such men. For, he believed, and, at quite great length and expense, defended and argued for, in his writings left behind for the reading pleasure of his readers and posterity, amongst which I count myself, invariably and incontestably. But, I digress, perhaps partially, although not altogether. The idea that the mind is limited to itself. Hume denied that man may possibly pronounce concerning bodies remote from the mind's possible comprehension, defending the position that the mind is some mode of mental hallucination, involving the inventing of concepts as it pertains to the perceived phenomena. I am afraid we have to return to our Greek for the present moment. And, let us recall, when in investigation of our terminology, phantasm, we discovered that, followed to certain etymological roots and foundational ultimate word sources, our term phantasm is descended of the Greek phano, therefore descended of the Greek term, phos. Light. This is a curious occurrence, is it not? Well, I should like to suggest that it is doubly mysterious. Because, consider the term, the phenomenal world. Well, what in heaven's name are we supposed to understand when we hear the utterance, phenomenal world? Well, certain men of science and of learning, very esteemed men of science and of learning I may add, have suggested, at great length, and, sometimes, even at great personal expense. Shall we not consider the spectacular philosophy encountered in the teachings of the hero Jacques de Molay? I do not suggest that de Molay adhered to some conviction or another. Only that, de Molay saw his conviction always as a light. And even in the very moment of his execution he did not depart from it, steadfastly adhering to it even in his final gasps of consciousness and comprehensibility and knowledge of the world. Dying, yet never renouncing, even in his death, his steadfastly believed and adhered to vigorously conviction that the phenomenal world is the world of tables, and of chairs, and of houses, both large and small, stationary and vehicular. Stationary, in the minds of these men, usually implies something to do with space. Yet, what is space? Space, indeed, is a very mystical variety of occurrence, because it occurs even privately in my sensory experience of the world, as pertaining to phantasms of the mind, that is. The materialist philosopher proposes that the bodies that I perceive and forthwith proceed to denominate, the phenomenal world, of tables, of chairs, and etc., exist beyond the barriers of the mind, in an independent realm, denominated, usually, the physical world. Now, the physical world, of these philosophers, is usually what other philosophers call only, the phenomenal world. Let us investigate the term, phenomenal, for a moment. To the Greek we must return. The ancient Greek philosophers, amongst which we may number Plato and the indubitably innovative Aristotle, for his contributions to formal investigations into the operations of the mechanisms of phenomena and of the thinking apparatus of the thinking individual. When discoursing in relation to what they denominated pheno, they would have been speaking concerning what they meant to imply as being, pertaining to light, as having, to do with light. But notice that their word, pheno, is the same Greek word from which issues the English term, phantasm, etymologically speaking. Descartes supposed, indeed, that he may not be in a doubt concerning his own existence. He agreed, in effect, that, yes, I may be hallucinating all that I call the phenomenal physical world all around me, and it may only be a phantasm in my imagination, simply a mirage constructed in the sentiments, in the subjective experience part of that species of creature denominated, usually, by the appellation, mankind, or the mammal termed and hitherto agreed to be denoted, Homo sapiens. Yet, cogito, ergo sum. What is the relationship? When the ancient Greek masters, in all their intellectual rigor, communicated concerning what they deemed pheno, invariably they referred to some intimate aspect of phos. When the present man, of the present era, at lengths and at great pains and at great extension, discourses concerning what men have hitherto denominated the phenomenal world, by virtue of the word which he employs, being founded upon the surfaces of the Greek word pheno, that is, and, therefore upon the surfaces of the Greek word phos, likewise, he pronounces concerning what the Greeks implied by pheno, therefore, too, by phos. The theories of death will play a central role in this text, and I was not sure if I should include them in the present volume or spare myself the exercise and incorporate such notions into the bounds of a separate work. For what appears in eternity, men have discoursed concerning death, suggesting that, upon death's arrival, the mind of man is extinguished, and his thoughts, his feelings, his passions, his desires, his beliefs and firm convictions collapse into a darkness and are entirely annihilated. Yet, there have been those other men who have vigorously protested, advancing many reasons in support of their convictions, that the mind of man is not extinguished upon the death of the corporeal body, but yet thrives in some kingdom remote from the physical one. Some say, in the presence of God. Yet others arguing, as certain Blavatskian theosophists or certain Steinerian anthroposophists may, that the soul of man is reincarnated. Death not being a complete annihilation, therefore, I should say that notions concerning the possible termination, or, as some other men might suggest, the continuation of the soul and of the mind of man, attending the corporeal death of his physical body, should be of substantial interest to any author dedicated to the project and exercise of enumerating and at length discoursing concerning the nature of the mind and of the soul of man. For it is the very mind itself which postulates such notions, those of death, those of reincarnation, and, as the Master Hume might have suggested, even those of the self to which sentiments and convictions immediately and irrevocably pertain. Hume suggested, at great length and with great precision, having applied a profound analysis of the most impartial and investigative variety, that what men have hitherto denoted themselves, or their self, is but a conceptual framework the mind invents as it perceives and relates to mere sense data in that mental operation hitherto denominated by men perception, suggesting that, when we turn our gaze towards our own appendages and limbs, for instance, when I perceive my hand, that I perceive only phantasms in the mind, images in the imagination, and not solid bodies in some exterior to, and independent from mind, physical environment. Now, such pronouncements may appear scandalous to the vulgar and philosophically untutored mind, and the great Master Berkeley even found it necessary to render his philosophy yet more apprehensible to the layman's untutored and simple comprehension, to compose his 3 dialogues, namely, those betwixt Hylas and Philinus, in order to render more clear what may have been left perhaps not so clear in the intricacies of his subtle immaterialist teachings. As found in his remarkably eloquent and incontestably genius magnum opus, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. Indeed, Berkeley rejected that physical bodies and physical space have any existence, arguing with great technical precision that those bodies that I perceive and forthwith denominate the physical or phenomenal world are but mere images and phantasms in the mind, mere hallucinations, that is, and that, in the absence of the perception in which these bodies are presented as perceptions, they collapse into an utter nothingness, and are altogether incomprehensibly annihilated, departing from existence. So that the apple that I perceive ceases to exist as a round, red, and succulent sensory apparition, upon my departure from the room in which the apple rests, let us say, upon an escritoire. Now Berkeley saw it fit to invoke the great mind of God, to account for the existence of the world. For, agreeing that an apple may exist only as an apparition to some mind, though never as a physical object remote from the intricate and subtle operations of the mind itself, Berkeley had to suppose that the moon did not altogether collapse into a state of non-existence when he entered into his chamber to, for the evening, retire. For, upon his own views, Berkeley would have to agree that, if a perceived body, for instance, an apple, or a moon's light, once a gentle winter's evening sky, only exists as perceived sense data and active sensory perception, or, in sensation proper, as technical phantasms in the mind, no different from dream images or what men have called hallucinations, even in the slightest. That it must also be true, given the preceding, that the apple, that I perceive upon my escritoire, and the moon that I behold when, towards those starry skies, I gaze, depart altogether, each of them, from existence, upon my no longer immediately perceiving them by my senses. To bar the way to such fantastic conclusions, and because he was not quite prepared to accept the radical proposition that the apple on my escritoire in my chamber is annihilated and removed altogether from existence upon my departure from that room, and, forthwith, is recreated anew upon my return to that very room now in question. Namely, the radical proposition that the apple, my escritoire, and my chamber, all, equally, depending on, for their existence, my perceiving them into being, they necessarily are destroyed and are exclusively annihilated, or recreated anew, depending upon whether I immediately apprehend them by my senses and my faculty of perception, or do not. To avoid such fantastic and spectacular conclusions, Berkeley supposed that a great mind, the mind of God, sustains everything. So that, even though I do not perceive the apple in my chamber when I depart from that room, certainly, the great mind of God, perceiving everything all at once, enables the apple in my chamber to subsist. For, though it be not apparent to my own feeble human mind, nevertheless, to the extraordinary and unbounded mind of God, it is revealed in all of its intricacies. Some men have even suggested that, even the finest parts of the apple, namely, its intricate networks of cells and molecular structures, the spectacular arrangement of protons and neutrons in the atoms of it, and even the flow of electricity and of energy at bottommost levels of the apple's constitution, are the handiwork of the genius mind of God, the forms which God has created. And some men have suggested that even man himself is a product of the labors of God, arguing that God himself, in a state of action, placed into existence not only the most incomprehensibly vast of galactical structures, not only the spectacular arrangement of neurons and protons in the atoms of the universe itself, but also that creature denominated by the appellation man, arguing, further, that God blessed man with thought and mind, so that, while the table, nor the chair, may be supposed to be occupied with thoughts or reflections, man, certainly, finds himself disposed to such variety of sentiment. And so, many writers, the likes of the incomparable and staggeringly sophisticated Descartes, have suggested that God may be known directly. Because, since God created the mind of man, therefore, may comprehend its creator. For, the mind may come to an understanding that the same hand which brought into existence all the many remote distant stars and galaxies, brought into existence the perceptions and experiences of those exactly the same remote distant stars and galaxies. Other men, however, have argumented differently. Some, like Hume. And whether Hume was an atheist or an agnostic is besides the point. Though, certainly, in his own time, he was accused of atheism by his contemporaries. Such men, as the extraordinarily brilliant Hume, have supposed that God is strictly a concept which the mind invents. Supposing that, because the mind encounters certain sensory perceptions, denominated impressions, in the sublime, extraordinary, and indubitably inspired texts of that great master, Hume, and, in order to account for said phenomena, for said impressions, that is, the mind conceptualizes, formulates, less forcible and lively, thoughts, that is, the great master Hume expressed, at great length, that it is inconceivable, very much in the spirit of the corpus Berkeleyanum, to suggest that any body exterior to mind may have subsistence, suggesting that, bereave matter of all its intelligible qualities, both primary and secondary, you in a manner annihilate it, and leave only a certain unknown, inexplicable something as the cause of our perceptions. A notion so imperfect that no skeptic will think it worth while to contend against it. As expressed in his great masterpiece and work of genius, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Hume, however, did not suppose that some great mind of God sustained the forms that he perceived when he departed from perceiving them, suggesting that Again, in his brilliant and legendary masterpiece, The Inquiry, the idea of God, as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being, arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind, and augmenting, without limit, those qualities of goodness and wisdom. Berkeley certainly would have placed himself in fervent opposition to Hume in this regard. However, as it pertains to the notion that, bereave matter of all its intelligible qualities, both primary and secondary, you in a manner annihilate it, Berkeley would have expressed assent to this suggestion. Now, certain men, when they have touched upon the theme of death, have suggested that death coincides with the termination of the operations of the mind. Though, as we have mentioned already, other men have disputed this. These latter men suggesting, contrarily, that the mind persists despite the body's corporeal death, either in the direct presence of Almighty God, or in another body, reincarnated, but, in some fashion, persists. And because the present text is meant to be an examination of the human mind, and because some men have suggested that the human mind is inextricably linked with the event denominated death, therefore I saw it not exclusively unreasonable to include a section to the topic, here, in the present work. The main purpose of the work will be, to attempt to make sense of the two general theories concerning the nature of the mind of man, the reproductional and the original. In summary, reproductional theories suggest that the phenomena I perceive, and forthwith denominate the phenomenal world, are reproductions of certain bodies, exterior to perception's grasp, namely, physical bodies in physical space, if not some other variety of unknown independent of mind substance. Such philosophers, who have argued in this way, maintain that my perceptions are caused by bodies exterior to my perception, and, therefore, exterior to my possible comprehension. And yet, it is these same men who will laugh at the proposition of the faithful that God has formed the universe. The distinction between the realist and the materialist, I think, right away, ought to be discussed, as this text will treat heavily of both positions. The realist is the one who asserts that the tree that I perceive when I have not ingested LSD is real and exists as a physical body in physical space, exterior to my mind, and exists not as some mere phantasm in my private mind. And, additionally, the geometrical visual hallucinations that I perceive upon ingestion of that very same mentioned compound, namely, upon ingestion of the anti-mentioned LSD psychoactive compound, do exist as some mere phantasms in my private mind, as hallucinations, and mere specters in the mind. The materialist may be such a man. Namely, the materialist may be a realist, and believe that the tree that he perceives belongs to a real physical and solid world, removed and apart from his own private mind. And, for this reason, he may be inclined to accept the belief that, finding that his very body itself, and, including his own corporeal members and appendages, namely, his hands, his arms, and his organs, etc., all, equally, belong to, and subsist, in the same, real physical and solid world, removed and apart from private mentation proper, in which, the real physical tree is supposed to subsist. He may be inclined to accept the belief that, the world of physical bodies causes the spectacle called private mind. Such a man is the materialist. He maintains, at great length, that, not only may we justifiably dissertate concerning bodies, as Hume rejected expressly that we may, but that these bodies arrange themselves into such intricate patterns, e.g., into neurons in the brain and into sensory organs, that, according to some fashion, render the hallucination that I call perception. And, yet, it is these same men who will, at once, suggest that the perceived forms, shapes, and patterns that arise in this hallucination, called perception, are, of themselves, not mere phantasm in the mind, not subjective images in perception, not sense data, not the stuff of private mind, but the stuff of some physical exterior to mind physical world. And, we see, at once, the contradiction in which these men involve themselves. granting special meaning to the declarations eloquently once pronounced by Berkeley in his magnum opus, that the far greater part, if not all, of those difficulties which have hitherto amused philosophers and blocked up the way to knowledge are entirely owing to ourselves. That we have first raised a dust and then complain we cannot see. The methods of Descartes and of Hume, of radical doubt, serve our purposes, and the purposes of the advancement of all knowledge. For such investigations enable man to finally discover the main difference between what is indubitably given and what is merely an unverifiable or an unverified inference. The subject of the present inquiry is indeed an intricate, subtle, and very delicate one. The mind seems to be not only the subject which we are aiming to develop an understanding of by means of this very inquiry, but, in a slightly odd turn of events, we discover that it is the mind itself which is embarking upon this journey. The more one reflects, the more one discovers that any endeavor to better understand the nature of the mind itself is always, necessarily, of itself, undertaken by the very mind itself. And we find a curiosity right here at the outset of our treatise. We are endeavoring to understand the mind, yet discover that the endeavor is the project of the very mind itself. Viz., as we've said, it is curious to note that the mind is the inquirer inquiring into the mind. Many interesting speculations arise upon profound contemplation of the mind. One of which, as we've mentioned, is the realization that the mind is, by virtue of being wherein thoughts occur, the very subject of those thoughts. Subject in the sense of the subjective experiencer thereof. Hume, at length, protested against the profane notion that some entity denotable of self subsists, independently of impressions and independently of thoughts. Such a notion, Hume thought, was outlandish and contrary to all proper reason and fact. And Hume had quite a lot to say concerning matters of fact, incidentally. I should like to be as upfront and as clear as I can possibly be. For my audience, whoever you may be, here, at the opening of our text. In the present text, I shall attempt to provide a system for the understanding of the mind. And this system will be composed of certain features or ideas. I believe that the mind is worthy of being studied. But it is a difficult thing. It requires that one be willing to depart from one's beliefs and one's convictions. I will not say that skepticism is the first proper step in any philosophical endeavor aiming to be absolutely wholly impartial, but only that prejudices take away the legs of the philosopher, rendering him incapable of any further advancement. Felipe Bautista. January 30th, 2023. Chicago, Illinois. Book 1. Part 1. Of the Battlefield of Ideas and the Circle of Paradox. The victory is not gained by the men-at-arms, who manage the pike and the sword, but by the trumpeters, drummers, and musicians of the army. David Hume. Section 1. It is possible. That is, it is not impossible. That I may, at any given moment, awaken to discover that the experience I am presently undergoing, all, had been a dream. I have a sense of being in the middle of a lifetime. Of having made friends. Of having adopted convictions and beliefs. Of having accumulated a collection of experiences, etc. And yet, for all of this, I may, at any moment, as we've mentioned, wake up to discover that I had only been dreaming. Or discover myself unplugged from some simulation. As did Neo in The Matrix. Etc. And I cannot, for this reason, trust my senses. As Descartes and the skeptics may have suggested. Or I may be, at present, as an inception, in some dream within a dream, ad infinitum. Or I may only be a mind lost in its own perceptions and conceptions. A mind lost in its own impressions and thoughts, as Hume might suggest. The soils of our planet, of our Mother Earth, have tasted incalculably the blood of many men. It may not be said with certainty how many men perished during the campaigns of Alexander the Great, but one must imagine that the number was by no measures a meager one, but one magnificent and substantial in its proportions. During the atrocities of the Second World War, over the battlefields of the war zone, another large quantity of the blood of men, our Mother Earth found herself consuming and being infecundated by. Throughout the evolution of our galaxy, our Mother Earth has tasted immeasurable amounts of man's blood. In all of man's wars, in all of man's conflicts, in all of man's battlefields and combat zones, a large part of that quantity of blood has been shed as the result of war and conflict in man's relations with himself. Man is the sort of animal who extinguishes his counterparts in extraordinary numbers as a result of a conviction in ideals. Alexander and his men slaughtered innumerably many opponents on the battlefield. And, in turn, many of Alexander's own men were slaughtered, similarly, by the enemy combatants. And so, our Mother Earth, as she is now accustomed to do, consumed the blood of many men during this period of Alexander's conquests. And, again, during the Second World War, our Mother Earth found herself feasting, in great proportion, of the blood of man. It is the battlefield where we want to begin our inquiry. Alexander had to go on to the field of battle to be successful in his conquest. If, instead, he chose to not send out a single unit of men and remain stationed at home forever, he never would have conquered anything. But Alexander conquered the entirety of the known world at that time. The area that he and his men managed to conquer stretched from Greece to the Mediterranean to the sacred land Egypt, including her unfathomably mysterious pyramids, and even east as far as India. Even great kings and rulers from other periods have had to enter the battlefield to achieve, successfully, an expansion of their domains, or to establish some variety of agreement between parties. A settlement, that is. In recent times, as already mentioned, the ruling powers of the early 1900s saw it fit to send to the slaughter incalculably many men upon the battlefields of 2 world wars. That is, not only one. Yes, it is because of these conflicts that our Mother Earth finds herself feasting heavily from the pouring bloods of man. And even the teachings of Christ are no exception. Nor may it be supposed that a devotion to Christ has not been at the center of many of the greatest periods of conflict and bloodshed in the history of mankind. Consider the period of the Inquisition, for instance, or the period of the Crusades. Some might intervene here and suggest that, no, the teachings of Christ do not teach to do harm one to another by means of warfare, but that, whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. To love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Now, whether such men, who argue this way, have a point, shall not be entered upon in the present inquiry. It being besides our purpose. Our main purpose is twofold. To discuss those general philosophical arguments called reproductional and original, respectively. Also, to establish, once and for all, what is that which is indubitably given and what is that which is merely an unverified or an unverifiable inference. The term, inference, is a technical one, and it shall come up at length in the present work. Let me provide a clear illustration of the project of the present work, so that its context and meaning may better be, ultimately, understood by the reader. The present text may be thought of as a piece on the battlefield of ideas. But what is the battlefield of ideas? Well, much in the same way that Alexander and his men fought upon the battlefield of the soils of the earth, philosophers have disputed amongst themselves on the battlefield of ideas. The battlefield of ideas may only exist, imagined. In other words, you have to imagine it, for it to exist. Therefore, I ask a small task of my reader. Namely, I should like him to put to work his imagination. And imagine, not a field of battle made up of soils and of mud, but made up of pure thoughts. In this battlefield of thoughts, philosophers combat each other. One philosopher protests, the mind of man ceases its operations upon the death of the corporeal body. Another asserts that, in contradiction to the former, the mind of man persists before the divine Almighty, or in another body, reincarnated, after the death of the corporeal body. The theosophists of Blavatsky and of Besant are known to have proposed this latter. And even the fourth-way students of the teachings of the school of the Master Gurdjieff, as well as Gurdjieff himself, have been known to argument in this way, positing reincarnation as a possibility. Imagine, if you will, a chessboard. Let us take this chessboard as our battlefield of ideas. Now, let us imagine that philosophers place their own pieces onto a square of this chessboard, hoping to advance it against other pieces advanced by other philosophers. Let us imagine that each one of these pieces is represented by the image of a book. That is, every philosopher places his piece onto the battlefield, onto the imaginary chessboard now being elaborated on and discussed. And that piece is a book. For Berkeley, his piece. Amongst others, of course. For he advanced multiple pieces. That is, he entered into the battlefield of ideas, that is, into our imaginary chessboard, with several pieces. Several books. Not only one. As many philosophers do, in fact. One of Berkeley's major pieces. Indeed, one of mankind's greatest masterworks of literature and of art in general, was his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. In this legendary treatise, Berkeley argued that the tree that I perceive is not a physical solid object in a physical solid world, but a phantasm in my mind, an object in my imagination, merely my own immediate sensations and impressions, as Hume liked to call them. Berkeley even used the materialist's own arguments to further his own immaterialist sentiments and convictions. If it is true that, when I feel pain only because of how certain neurons are activated in a certain way by discharging in a certain brain interacting with a certain nervous system and organ called the skin, etc., then it must be true that, when I perceive a red apple, I perceive only an image created in my own private field of perception, by how certain waves of light interact with the retinas of my eyes, and with my overall nervous system, and with my brain and its corresponding neural activities. That I see a red apple where the colorblind man sees a not colored red apple is due to the fact that neither of us perceives the apple as it actually is, but only the apple as it is represented to our personal first-person perceptual experience and mind. Only to our own private mind and perception, that is. If both I and the colorblind man perceive the apple as it actually is, then we will not be in any disagreement concerning its color. But, because I only have access to the apple as it shows itself to my own private mind, and the colorblind man, likewise, has only access to the apple as it shows itself to his own private mind, we are in disagreement. He suggests that the apple, in fact, does not appear to be red, whereas I object to this, maintaining vigorously that, in fact, the apple does appear to be red. However, only red, to my perception. To the perception of the colorblind man, the apple shall appear, not red. Therefore, Berkeley may have supposed, the apple that I perceive and the apple that the colorblind man perceives, neither are a solid physical apple, but an apple in personal perception. A technical phantasm in the mind. A literal hallucination being created by neural activity in a brain. The colorblind man perceives a non-red apple because he is only perceiving a private imagination in his own field of personal and private perception. Whereas, in my own field of personal and private perception, a red apple appears. In both cases. In the case of myself and the colorblind man. Supposing myself not colorblind, that is. We see that, both of us, perceive only a literal phantasm in the mind. A hallucination that our brains, eyes, and nervous systems somehow mystically create. When I walk through a park, and perceive an elegant tree, as Berkeley would suggest, I do not perceive a solid physical thing, but a mental hallucination in a mind. A perception, that is. Or what Hume called, an impression. When I perceive an optical illusion, for instance, when I perceive Knitz's triangle, in fact, I perceive a phantasm in the mind. There is no defined bright white triangle anywhere present in Knitz's triangle. Nevertheless, in my own field of perception, I perceive a bright white triangle. Berkeley will suggest that, not only the bright white triangle is an optical illusion happening in the mind's field of private perception, But so too is the surface upon which you perceive said triangle represented. And so too is the neighbor with whom you discoursed the other day. And so too is the sky that you perceive when you look upwardly. And so too, your fingers and your arms when you perceive them. So too, your memories and feelings. So too, your thoughts and your convictions. So too, all of your beliefs, all of your sentiments, and your passions. All being illusions created by neurons electrically discharging in a brain. If the bright white triangle that I perceive, when gazing upon that of Knitz's, is only a phantasm in the mind, Berkeley wants to argue that, so too is everything else perceived by the mind. All of its feelings, all of its sentiments, all of its perceptions, all of its thoughts, all of its emotional experiences, etc. When, on a cold February day, I walk upon an icy ground, nearby a frozen lake, and perceive a brilliant sky of clouds in dance. Those clouds, Berkeley will have us understand, are merely my imagination. Technically, not figuratively speaking. Being a hallucinatory image created in some, namely, in my, mind's perception, by how certain neurons and a certain nervous system and a certain set of eyes and a certain brain interrelate. So too, the sensation of cold that I feel on my face as the winds blow. So too, the numbness in my toes accompanying the frigid air temperature, etc. From this, it will follow that I only interact with a world in my own mind, and not any real physical solid world, ever. Berkeley and Collier's suggested as much. And Hume did not find himself in opposition to these thinkers.